Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk about color stories, and why I feel that they're extremely important to the overall landscape, especially the lore landscape of League of Legends, and why there are a lot of champions that definitely deserve to continue to have these. Now, for those of you who missed all the discussion that was happening over on Twitter and Reddit, players checked out the universe page when Briar was added. She's up on the universe, and they realized that she doesn't have her color story. Normally when a champion is released, they get two things. They get a bio, which is just a short biography detailing who they are, where they've come from, what their powers are, that kind of thing. And then they have what's called a color story, which is an additional story written about the champion, usually either from their perspective or from the perspective of a bystander, to kind of give a little bit more context about their personality, their abilities, what they think of things, those sorts of things. And now, Briar's was missing, and she wasn't the first one either. Naafiri, who'd released obviously a few months ago, was also missing her color story. And when pressed, Riot confirmed over on Twitter that they were no longer writing color stories for champions at all. They made some excuse about how low engagement meant that they could no longer do it, and how they were shifting towards cinematics to deliver lore content for champions as opposed to the color stories. Now, this smacks of not only executive mismanagement, right? Some exec saying, why are you spending so much time writing stories? We don't want to write stories anymore. But it's also a bad reason overall. The reason Riot gave for wanting to keep Dark Cosmic Erasure Jhin around was because it was valuable to a small subset of players. So this idea that a small subset of players enjoying the color stories was bad, but the small subset of players that are willing to spend $200 on a skin is good. Obviously, we know why they feel that way, but it's not a good reason if you're already going to say that about something else entirely. So today I wanted to talk about why color stories are important and why they're worth keeping around. Now, one thing I wanted to mention at first is Riot's argument of cinematics as being a substitute, that they were just going to be creating videos instead of making color stories for champions. And admittedly, we've seen this in like the Briar cinematic that was just put out recently to sort of showcase her. You could argue that that sort of acts as her color story. Indeed, I would expect that the sort of story of the Briar cinematic would have been very similar to what the story for the Briar color story would have been. But that said, cinematics are a flawed replacement for color stories. These are generally created to generate hype, not to get us to know the character, right? The purpose of the cinematic is to say, in big, flashy, bold letters, hey, this is the new champion, and this is kind of what they're about, get excited. They're not really there to help us to get to know the champion, they're mostly just there to build excitement for the actual player base. If you look at the Briar cinematic, for example, about 90% of it was just Briar killing dudes, with no real development of the character at all, except maybe a little tiny bit at the end where she puts her chains back on, and even then, there isn't any context given for that. In a color story, you would have been able to illustrate why Briar decided to reshackle herself, but in the cinematic, of course, it just comes across as completely arbitrary. We don't really care. We already saw the cool action part and got excited about the release of the new character, more so than getting to know the character as a person. As another recent example, Naafiri's cinematic was extremely vague. There was lots of symbolism and room for interpretation, but not a lot of concrete information about who she is, what her relationships are like to the other Darkin, why Naafiri specifically believes she can unite the Darkin, right? There's a lot that's just sort of left up in the air that we don't have any context for from the Naafiri cinematic, because the purpose wasn't to tell stories. The purpose was to generate hype. This is doubly true because not every champion even gets a real cinematic when they're releasing. Melio and Neela arguably didn't get cinematics that did any kind of storytelling whatsoever beyond telling us things that we could have gleaned from just looking at their splash arts, right? It's like, oh, Melio's an innocent young boy with fire powers. Neela is a badass woman with water powers who fights giant monsters. That's all the cinematics told us, quote-unquote cinematics, most of it's in-game footage. And the rest of it is stuff that you could tell from just looking at the champion's splash art. So clearly cinematics aren't the replacement for color stories that Riot believe them to be. The other issue with color stories, of course, is that they are the only way that you can really develop characters and get us have a way for us to really get to know them and what they're like. Again, in a cinematic, it's all about building hype. You have to have something exciting happen, but color stories, quite frequently, didn't have a lot of action in them, and in fact could tell us things about the character that would subvert expectations. As an example, if Garen were to release today, I would expect his cinematic, right, would be Garen, crashing onto the battlefield, dueling a powerful Noxian, showcasing that he's this big, brash, loud paladin who believes in Demacia and Demacia alone. His color story, though, shows us a very different picture of Garen, where we have a hag in a cave who's taken a member of the Dauntless Vanguard hostage, and instead of just busting into the cave and swinging his sword around and shouting, Garen walks in, sits down next to her, and says, "How can I get my guy back?" That tells us something about the character, right? Something that you would not have gotten from a cinematic, something that you would not have gotten from just looking at the splash art. It's a way to help develop him. If you haven't read the whole story, by the way, go read it. It's phenomenal, and I'm not just saying this because I'm biased towards Garen, but that kind of thing is extremely interesting and fun to talk about and fun to read, more so than just a cinematic that you're going to consume once and say, okay, I'm excited for Garen now, and then never think about it again. Similarly, some of these other color stories, like Kassadin's, for example, it's less about Kassadin fighting void monsters in the underground and more about developing Kassadin as a character, showing us why he's doing what he's doing, where he found a lot of the gear that he found in order to fight back. For example, the color story reveals that the Nether Blade originally belonged to an Ascended warrior named Horok. That's important lore information that can't really be delivered in a cinematic outside of maybe showcasing, a split-second frame of some Ascended guy with the Nether Blade, and then the community spends, months, if not years, speculating about it. It's in the lore, right? It's in the color story, which it's right there. You don't have to speculate on it. And again, these are things that only the color story can do. You're not going to make a cinematic where Kassadin has an internal monologue the whole time. You're going to have a cinematic about Kassadin murdering void monsters, right? And the other thing is that color stories are one of our few windows into the Runeterra universe, right? They let us glean small details about places, cultures, wildlife, environments, just everything. You can go through every single color story with a fine-toothed comb and pick up on things that you wouldn't otherwise know. And as Riot have decreasingly produced lore content for Runeterra over the last few years, much to my chagrin, bios and color stories were some of the last bastions of lore content that we could count on. And cinematics, again, you can't do some of this development. You can't have an aside in a cinematic to say, like, oh yeah, Neela ran past this stall, which was selling, these kinds of fruits, which are only found in Shurima, right? Or whatever, right? I'm spitballing here. But that kind of thing, you're not going to do in cinematics. You can't make time for it. All you can do is speculate about it, or, confirm it afterwards in a tweet in a very non-organic way. Color stories do so many useful things on that front. The other thing is, color stories are one of the only pieces of content that a champion is guaranteed to get. Right? When a champion launches, they're guaranteed a bio, a color story, and basically nothing else. From there, it kind of depends on where they fall popularity-wise. If the champion is popular, let's use Yasuo as an example, Riot will jump through hoops to produce additional content for that champion. They're often guaranteed at least one skin per year, some get multiple skins a year, they'll likely be fast-tracked for a legendary skin, they're more likely to feature in promotional artwork like the client login page or art published on the official website, they're more likely to appear in other cinematics, right, like season start cinematics that usually have nothing to do with the lore whatsoever, but they're like, yeah, we're going to showcase the cool champions that we like best and that people like the best. And even they have a chance to appear in other Riot games or Riot Forge games. Conversely, if the new champion proves to be unpopular, let's take Zac as an example, the only thing you're ever guaranteed to get is your bio and your color story. You're likely to not get a skin per year, you're likely to never show up in a cinematic, you're likely to never get any promotional artwork unless you happen to be, like, gameplay related to something that Riot are doing. Zac, I know, for example, was featured in the tank update artwork back in 2016. Right, these things aren't guaranteed to happen if you're unpopular, and as a result, the color story is one of the few things that we actually have that we can even use to look at the champion. Who is this character? What are they like? What are their likes, their dislikes, their personality? We know none of that if we don't have a color story. If all we have is the bio, we have an extremely limited amount of information that is guaranteed for each champion, and it's just not enough in my opinion. So as a result, I feel like this decision by Riot to stop doing color stories just doesn't make sense from so many perspectives. I know Riot recently got like a new creative director and that he has different ideas about what it is they want to be doing, but in general, I just feel like there's not enough of a... We haven't seen any replacement yet, and I think that this is not the place to cut, and this is not the place to stop doing lore content, right? Like, absolutely, this should not be the thing that Riot have decided, yeah, we've decided we don't want to actually do this one thing that didn't take us that much to do. That's the one thing we're going to decide we didn't want to do. Right? It doesn't make any sense to me, and I would love to see Riot reverse course on this decision and bring back color stories, as I feel like it's a very important part of the League of Legends ecosystem that they've literally been doing for years now. A full decade of color stories, and just now they've decided, actually, we don't like that. But let me know what you think of all this down in the comment section below, especially if you're in the camp that says, I like cinematics more. let me know why you like cinematics more. I'm legitimately not going to flame you. I'm just curious about if people actually think that cinematics are a worthy replacement for the champion color stories. Let me know all that down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.